everyone, and welcome to our episode for July of Poets in Conversation here at A Mighty Blaze. I'm honored today to be talking with the esteemed poets Tishani Doshi and Zeina Beck, who it turns out are friends with each other as well. So it's really exciting to have you both here. For people who aren't familiar, A Mighty Blaze is a all creatives, all volunteer writing and creative organization where we just try to connect writers with other creatives and readers throughout the pandemic, and now it looks like beyond as well. So thank you for those of you tuning in, and let me remind people right away that we will be having a Q&A at the end of the conversation. So if you want to be thinking of questions to pose to Zeina and Tishani, you can put those in the comments at any time and we'll pose them. So welcome, hearty welcome to Tishani and to Zeina. How are you both today?
Good. Thank you. It's about 6 o'clock in the evening in Italy, and it's been very hot, but used to that by this stage. Zeina is just waking up though.
I'm just waking up. I tried to slap some makeup on to not look so unfresh, but yeah, it's 9 a.m. in California. And it's actually a cool day. It's a lovely, cool day.
Hopefully it will hold. Yeah, thank you both for doing this. We have a special day and time to accommodate the multiple time zones. So we're half across the globe on this one. Well, I want to, first of all, celebrate both of your books and remind everyone what they look like. These are the two latest collections, Zeina's Hot Off the Presses book and Tishani's A God at the Door. For people who aren't familiar, I imagine most viewers are familiar, but for people who aren't familiar, I just want to introduce you both more formally. I'll start with Tishani. Tishani Doshi is an award-winning writer and dancer of Welsh Gujarati descent. Born in Madras, she received a master's in writing from Johns Hopkins and worked in London in advertising before returning to India, where a chance encounter with the choreographer Chandralekha led her to an unexpected career in dance, which I hope we'll get a chance to talk about today. Tishani has published 8 books of fiction and poetry, including the collections Girls Are Coming Out of the Woods, which I've got over here, which was shortlisted for the Ted Hughes Award and a Firecracker Award, and the novel Small Days and Nights, which I'm currently reading, is also really good, which was shortlisted for the RSL Ondaatje Prize, the Tata Book of the Year, and the New York Times Book Review edition. Tishani has published essays as well in The Hindu, Granta, The National, The New York Times, The Guardian, Lit Hub, and Corriere della Sera. Tishani is a visiting professor of creative writing at NYU Abu Dhabi and otherwise lives on a beach in Tamil Nadu, which makes me very, very jealous. And I just want to say, for people who haven't come across the book, this is one of the many covers because the different versions have different covers. But it's not only are there different forms, but there's Carmina Figurata, there's sort of different shapes to the poems and stuff. So it's just a really interesting collection. So welcome to you, Tishani. It's such a pleasure to have you here.
Thank you.
And Zeina Beck with the Hot Off the Presses. As I mentioned, Zeina Beck is a Lebanese poet and author of 2 previous full-length collections, Louder Than Hearts and To Live in Autumn, as well as 2 chapbooks. Zeina was educated in Arabic, English, and French, and has degrees in English Lit from the American University of Beirut. Her poem Makam won Poetry's Frederick Bach Prize, and her work appears in the New York Times, Plowshares, Poetry, and elsewhere. Zeina is also the co-creator and co-host with poet Farah Shamma of Maksuda, a podcast about Arabic poetry, which I think you mentioned you have an episode coming up soon, which is great. And after a lifetime in Lebanon and a decade in Dubai, Zeina has recently moved to California, and hence our 3 time zones. Welcome to you, Zeina, as well, and thank you for sharing your morning coffee with us.
Thank you for having us, Allison.
Yeah, it's a real pleasure. As I said, I've been reading both of your work for years, and I'm always so excited and amazed at how you're both prolific. And every time I feel like I could interview you about your last book, a new one comes out. So congratulations on that. I'm going to need to take some notes. And related to that, I thought we could start off with a question about the new books. You both now are several books in, and you both write poetry and prose. And so I'm wondering a little bit about what you learned about yourself and about poetry and the writing of poetry in particular in these new collections. Like, what did the new book bring to you that you didn't expect? Tishani, since it's later in the day, maybe we can start with you.
Yay!
Yeah. I hope my internet stays. It felt like I missed something and it was a bit wobbly, and I don't know if it was just for me or anyway. We'll see how it goes. I think the poems in this book came very they came all of a sudden, and they came very with a lot of urgency, I suppose, and I was surprised by that, and there was a moment of realization that I had a book, and which is very different from any experience I've had, of especially writing prose, where it's such a slog and there's such a different sort of approach to the novel, where you kind of have to stay in it for a long time, but you don't know if it's enough. And this just felt like I'm just going to write one poem, then I'm just going to write another poem, and then they just accumulated, and suddenly I had a book. And in a way, it just made me, yeah, it made me really realize why I love poetry. Because there is this sense of urgency which allows you to feel, while you are making the poems, really in it, a real sharpness. And at the same time, there is an ambition of the book which realizes itself without having to do too much maneuvering, so I love that.
I'm curious, Tishani, remember when I interviewed you for the BBC Four show? Was
Yeah.
that at the beginning of you writing these like shape poems? Because you sent us a bunch of these like
Yeah.
center page shaped poems. I remember for the
Yeah, I mean, it was really just, I think, a few months into the pandemic, right, in 2020.
yeah.
And that's when, I mean, I had written some of the poems earlier, but yeah, most of them came about at that time. And it was a really lush, productive time. And I was interested in shape, and I was thinking about containers, and particularly because we were all so boxed in and hemmed in, and it was this sense of what what happens to the poem on the page. Does the poem also have to take up a certain space? Or yeah, I was really playing with that a lot at that time. Yeah.
Yeah. I guess for me, I agree with Tishani. When I write poetry, it comes in waves. I don't write much prose. I mean, I've released an essay titled "The Last of the Bougainvillea Years," which is about leaving Dubai and Lebanon, and ultimately coming here. And it literally took me 2 years to finish. So I agree with you. It's just it's more for me. It's more difficult, and it's also um, it requires more of me, like psychologically, to dive into and come back out of. Whereas poetry, even when I'm writing about loss or grief, gives me back something to re-energize me, I feel.
Mm.
So I also write poetry in waves, but I did feel that for there was a slight shift in focus for me, in that the first book, To Live in Autumn, was about Beirut. The second book had Beirut and Tripoli and Syria and Iraq and Palestine and so many countries in it. And I feel like in that earlier work, yes, it's still my voice, but I was very much, and still am, obsessed with place, and like what makes a place, what makes a city, and was deliberately writing about places, or like Arabic culture through like Arabic singers or Arabic music. That was a lot, that featured a lot in Louder Than Hearts.
Mm.
Whereas in I feel there was a turn inward. I feel that the poems are quote unquote quieter. And I wanted to experiment. Okay, Zeina, like what if you stop writing? Not stop, I mean, I thought I would stop writing about cities, but of course it's impossible for me. But what if you turn it a little bit inward and actually dare to focus on topics like motherhood that I had been avoiding a little bit up until that point, because probably I wasn't ready for, or friendship, or um, just faith, just what goes on in your little head all the time, instead of like So instead of like zooming out like this, it felt like, oh, it was kind of bringing everything inward. I don't know if that makes sense, but that was the shift for me.
Well, I'm thinking of some specific poems. I mean, when I was reading one of the things that kept occurring to me is Italo Calvino's Invisible Cities, and how in that book, Marco Polo constantly makes reference to his home base or his point of comparison being Venice. So every city he travels, which is maybe catalyzed by observation, but mainly imaginative, it's a facsimile or a version of Venice, because he can never not be in Venice, because everything is sort of inherently comparative. And I felt like there was that thread running through very much. In fact, I have a related question for both of you. And I'm glad you brought up place, because I thought that both books, they address place, but not in a descriptive way, in a very, multidimensional way. And so the way I framed it here is both of you are deeply anchored in place, and place being related to kind of cultural identity. But I think of you both as citizens of the world. And I don't know if you identify with that, but at least that's how I think a lot of times your poems address, relationships between what are often artificial divisions between, land masses, et cetera, but then have cultural significance. And so I wondered if you could talk a little bit. Both books are so rich in what I might call formal experimentation, but what I really mean as like layout on the page. You've got contrapuntal poems, you have creative heroic sonnets, you have triptychs, and poems that can be read multiple ways. Tishani, I know one of your poems has an arrow to direct which way it's read. And so I was just wondering a little bit if you could talk about how your exploration of place and culture relates to the experiments in the book, the sort of formal and physical experiments of the book. Does that question make sense?
My turn. I don't think that as I'm writing in a certain form, like a ghazal or the heroic sonnet, or that I'm directly thinking about place. I think it kind of seeps in almost without me realizing or even wanting it to. So nothing that I've done there, I feel, was initially deliberate in terms of like the relationship between the form and the place. But I want to say that I've never thought of myself as a formal poet. I always ran away from form because it scared me. And over the years, it started with the ghazal actually. People kept like coming back to my ghazal and say, oh, you write ghazals. And I'm like, sometimes, from time to time. And then it became like, yeah, actually, I write ghazals all the time. Okay, yeah, I love form, so I just discovered it, and it's, I think, more, it's there, form is there. And I feel that I love form because it's so liberating. How do you, like the heroic sonnet, for example? I wanted to write a poem about motherhood. And I wanted to write about a poem about like generations of motherhood, like me and my daughters and my mother and her mother, and what gets inherited and what cycles are continued and what cycles are broken. And I was like, whoa, how am I going to do this? And the heroic, the heroic crown helps because it's such a vast topic, because it gives it a container, right? So I love that about form. What I love about the ghazal is the juxtaposition, a lot of juxtaposition and jumping around from, I think my brain, all poets' brains jump around from God, and then cooking, and then this tree, and then my body. And we keep making this, and the ghazal allows you, frees you in a way like, yeah, you can make any jump you want between one couplet and the other. So I just feel like I leaned into form more. I don't know if it's related to place in any way.
That's really interesting. I think there are forms that I go back to. I probably have sestinas in each of my books of poems, and I think partly it's because there is a there is an element of memory, and the way that memory is used in poetry, of a kind of returning and returning again, to either a scene or a moment, and a kind of, through the returning, trying to understand something. And so what I loved about the sestina is the returning of those words that you have to keep coming up against, but also transforming as you go along, so that by the end of the poem there's some kind of change. So I have like a sestina, called Memory of Wales, where I meet my mother in a playground in Wales, and she's a young girl, and so we are girls together playing, and then she's a woman by the end of it who's deciding to leave and go to India. And it's of course a way of the poem to contain, as Zena was talking about, the idea of mothers and daughters and generations, and place and leaving, and what it means to belong somewhere, and what it means to leave. But also it's this wonderful question of putting some kind of structure around what could potentially be too much as a subject,
Yeah.
and so in this book, in God of the Door, I have a sestina for Mr. President Duterte, who made a comment about shooting female rebels in the vagina. And so it was very conscious which words, I needed to keep coming back to Duterte, I needed to keep coming back to vagina, and what happens in the poem by coming back to those words. And at the end of the poem, is there a kind of leap? And so, whether it's the sonnet, or whether it's a ghazal, or whether it's, whatever the form is, each form has its own architecture that I suppose as poets we can sort of get excited about, that they allow certain things. And because of the kind of scaffolding in place, something is happening with the language which gains a greater um it has the ability to enlarge itself somehow, rather than just going straight through. So I think that's the thing about form, that while it is terrifying, um it is also deeply satisfying to work with structure.
One of the poems that did exactly what you just described, Tishani, for me in Zeina's book actually was What the Returning Do. And I wondered if you would potentially read that for us, Zeina, on page 36 for anyone who might be following along. I found myself, repetition requires review and sort of remetabolizing of a word. And so with this one, I really was shocked myself to see how much juice was squeezed out of the word love. And I don't mean that in a destructive, but a generative way. So I wondered if you could read it for us, Zeina, if you would, as an example of what you've both been talking about.
Sure. This is a ghazal. I think it's a bit of a broken ghazal, because I've allowed myself in this ghazal to do enjambments between one couplet and the other, which normally, you must not do. but I allowed myself this. What the returning do. 3 years of absence bring dead things and new love. Here's the old house. What you smell is true, love. Bird carcass trapped between wall and flower pot, so you do what the returning do. Love what you pound with broomstick until dried bones and feathers fall. Who, love, can say if this century is worse than others? And despite what you know and knew, love comes back as your city or your old friend dipping fries in Lebne. They ask you, love, have you been cured or are you still an optimist? Does the woman who grew love and flowers inside empty gas grenades still bring you hope? They say few love the way you do, but they forget it's been a while. They too love olives, though they're tired of odes and elegies. You wake and pursue love, look in the mirror, read the news. Sometimes you wonder how two loves so conflicting persist. Then you remember driving away can get you through love and borders and some of the days. You can't predict what time decides. How's the view, love?
Oh,
Thank you.
Zeina, are there any poems in O that surprised you when you wrote them?
Oh, that's a good question. Yes. Can I cheat and look at the table of content? I mean, poems always surprise me. I think particularly maybe the duets are what surprised me the most, because I didn't expect to be writing in a bilingual form. I didn't expect to be creating a bilingual form. The duets kind of sneaked in on my consciousness. And then I was like, okay, fine, I'll write bilingually, you know? So I think, yeah, the duet form is what surprised me the most. And it was the first duet I wrote was Daily Kulla Yawm, which I wrote in Arabic. And I know I said in one interview somewhere that I wrote it in English first, but it's not true. I wrote it in Arabic first. See, this is what happens. You don't even remember what language started first. But I actually wrote it in Arabic, and that was because I was working on the podcast that you mentioned in the bio, Maqsuda, which is in Arabic about Arabic poetry. So I was reading a lot of Arabic poetry at the time. I returned to it more than usual. And so the poem came first in Arabic, and then I translated it into English because I didn't trust myself in Arabic. And then I thought, no, the English must speak to it in like different words. And so that form kind of surprised me a little bit. And I also kind of leaned into like, what happens if I decide to write bilingually? So yeah, and I think the two of the poems, okay, two kinds of poems surprised me. Time, which is a poem I wrote for my daughter Aya when she was diagnosed with type 1 diabetes in August 2021, so very recently, was one of these poems. Like, I was burnt out. She had just been diagnosed. It had been a month. I was just sitting there, miserable at 5 a.m., looking out into my like temporary garden, knowing I was about to immigrate to the US and thinking of a zillion things. And then a poem comes, and the poem almost soothed me into like, okay, it's fine, So I remember that particular moment when I wrote Time very, very clearly, actually. And the poem, Thank You, Antidepressants, I didn't expect it as well. Tishani, we were in the same issue. Like, there was an issue, the MIT review. We were solicited to like write poetry about the brain. And I was like, poetry about the brain, what am I going to write? And then I had just started taking antidepressants, and I was like, thank you, antidepressants. So it kind of surprised me as well. And Tishani was in that same issue as well.
Yeah.
About brain issue.
I wrote about a sex bot, but I don't have one. It's just thinking about the ramifications of that and gender within that and all of that. So yeah, it was a really interesting commission. I think sometimes, you were talking about poems and their movement, and I've often thought about the movement from in to out and out to in, and where does the poem start? And it's true that sometimes the movement is coming from the out in, and sometimes it's this other way. And commissions I think are sort of putting the point outside of you and then saying, okay, join the dot. Like, how can you connect yourself to this thing that is, could be something that you care about and could be something really random. But it's an interesting exercise, and I think some really wonderful poems come out of that.
Well, I have a related question, and then I hope that we can lead ourselves to your beautiful poem, Tishani, Tree of Life. But I wanted to ask a little bit about the flexibility you both use. Well, first of all, let me just go back for a second and say I was recently reading for a book contest, And there was one manuscript, I won't go into detail, of course, but there was one manuscript where the author it started by shifting back and forth between two languages, one in which I was fluent, and the other in which I was like pretty good, but not complete. And then as the manuscript continued, it started to get down to the blurring of two languages in single words. So a word would start in one language and end in another. And it was just really like the ultimate home language. I felt that I was, and I felt so invited into the writer's life. And I just felt like I really got a sense of who this person was, because obviously this is like, well, at least in terms of the voice that was being presented in the book, this is who this person is someone who, thinks between different languages or within. And in fact, there's not a division in the same way that we often talk about words. So I find it so interesting. And I have a related question for both of you, which is about the flexibility your poems show, an awareness at times of multiple audiences and different audiences, and audiences who will get some references and won't get others. Zeina, of course, your duets using Arabic and not just Arabic that appears in Romanization, but Arabic written in Arabic. So people who need to read it, not just speak it. And then Tishani, I thought your poem that dealt with this question really explicitly was, "This may reach you either as a bird or flower," where I thought there was this interesting setup of almost like a Rorschach. So I wondered, Tishani, maybe you could start us off in talking about how you approach writing about topics or references that you feel like are going to be very clear to some audiences and perhaps less clear to some other audiences. And if you find that process to be energizing, if you approach the poems in a certain way, what do you think about how you handle references that some people will get and some people won't?
Well, I feel like as a reader, as a poet, as a person who is curious and alive, that I have a very wide radar, whether it's for movies or books or art, and I'm always aware of what I don't know, and I'm always trying to know more. And this is like just this like continuous cycle of and partly it's because I want to arrive at a state of wonderment. For me, I think that is one of the key aspects of art making and participating in art, is to have a moment of wonder. And so I'm always sort of looking for that. And I think sometimes while I'm reading around or researching something, I'll come across something and I think, oh, can I take that and use it in some way? And I think the big difficulty is not having to explain your point of reference. So for example, in Tree of Life, which I'll read, I mention Simone de Beauvoir, and for some audiences, there's no need to explain who that is. But then I also mention Satyajit Ray and his movie Pattar Panchali, which, he is one of India's great cinematographers, but also known worldwide. But for people who like cinema, and so maybe not everybody has seen Abu, the trilogy, like I have, and then you think, well, that gives the poem a little extra texture if you have seen the film, if you know about it. But does the poem still work if you don't have that texture? And I suppose that's the point of sort of working through, is that you are interested ultimately not in just saying a point simply, but in using layer and texture and palette and register, and you have all of these tools to create this kind of tapestry that's quite rich. And so the idea is that not everybody will get it, and maybe even if you have all the references, when you read a poem, you may not get it on the very first read. And so I think you have to stop worrying about that as a maker of poems, and just write what you think is arriving to you, like those juxtapositions that you were talking about, that suddenly you move from here to there. That's the synapse in the brain that's just unique and connecting it. And so I feel that that's the surprise in the poem, and you have to trust it. And I also feel that as a person who comes from the global south, that we do a lot of work for trying to understand stuff that we may not be part of our culture,
Yeah.
taking the very basic example of Enid Blyton and the ginger beer, like for years and years, I just thought the most scrumptious thing would be to be on a picnic and drinking ginger beer, even though I'd never had a ginger beer. Having tasted it, I don't really like ginger beer, but for a long time, ginger beer, jam rolls, and so I think also there is something, especially in poetry, that is the magic in sound. Words have a kind of a power of just saying it, and so by saying it aloud, there is a kind of incantation that happens,
Mm,
and meaning is less important at that point. So there is a way to feel a poem
mm,
even if you don't understand it, and I think that we all have felt that about poems at poetry readings when we're reading them, and I think that that's the magic and mystery of poetry. And so it is, I don't think of it as my job to break that down about choices. It's probably intuitive. Sometimes I think, okay, this jump is really not working, but yeah, you do have the decision, but a lot of the time this kind of strange putting together is the fun part about writing, and it is where we're being led, where we can't predict. So
yeah. Yeah, I remember reading lunch poems by Frank O'Hara, having never been to New York and not knowing one reference in that book, but still kind of reading it. Like, I never thought, oh, I don't understand this word. Do you know? Like, yeah. So I
yeah,
agree.
yes, yeah.
I found it interesting because there are so many like news items that seemingly have inspired many of the poems in A God at the Door, and I found myself really grateful that the notes related to them occurred at the end of the book, because in most cases I got that there was a current events or historical context and I could parse it out, or I look things up. It's not hard to sort of figure. But I also thought that it was a question of me as the reader engaging with the writer on a kind of more emotional or kind of beyond cognition level before I got information that would in some ways shut the door to all the explorations of the poem. So I thought that was really interesting. And in fact, Tree of Life is one that relates to that. So I wondered if you would mind reading the poem and then, talking a bit about it. It's such a great poem. For anyone who's following along, this is on page 33 of A God at the Door.
So yeah, this is taken from a news headline, and it is Bengal men self-quarantine on tree to keep others safe. And so this was one of the many news headlines during the unfolding of the COVID pandemic in India. Tree of Life. It could be romantic to sleep in a tree with all the sounds of the forest around, insect cacophony, elephants in must. I have always loved the word rut, a seasonal glut, the opposite of looking through a window to a never-ending view of wives washing dishes in the sink, Simone de Beauvoir's idea of the domestic abyss. But reader, she had silk curtains and chandeliers. She had multiple lovers and appointments with Sartre in the Jardin du Luxembourg. It is dangerous to romanticize anyone's life, especially low to purge the nobility of the poor. So let me not say how much I cried watching Satyajit Ray's Patthar Panchali, especially the part with the kids running through fields of Kash to watch the train of modernity pass. More poignant if you know the director's wife had to pawn her jewels for the film to be made. The goodness of some women, they almost levitate. Like the girl in the film, Child of the Forest, how she picks thorns from her feet like stones from rice. And the crone, how I love the crone, how all this sadness builds like a raga to bring on rain, which the girl rushes into, of course, ripple of water lilies, siege of cranes. How all this joy leads to death. There are no spare rooms, is the point. In the film or real life, there are no spare rooms. So these men who've returned from the city are put in a tree to quarantine, a tree that strangles its host as it walks, munificent shade-giving banyan that hurls down roots as trunks, in whose leaves God Krishna is domiciled. Krishna who talks good game about the temporality of the body while enjoying the bliss of so many pretty bodies, understood the material world as one huge inverted banyan. But as we're here in this reflection, why not enjoy the fruits? Why not leap from branch to branch like a hoopoe, which these men do, I suppose? Their good wives leave supplies at the base, rice and oil, cooking implements. It goes like this for days. This story of 7 men in a tree surviving a 21st century pandemic. Men who say they're pleased not to pass on any bad city virus. And because the news is so full of horrors and counterfeits, can't we for once just succumb to the romance before us? Forget that the tree is moving, that one day its phantom limbs will tap against our door. Till then, can't we stand by our windows and stare at all the desolation and sweetness? Can't we adore the convoluted roots of our attachments, how they complete us? My God, how this living is a hymn. Can you hear me?
I can hear you. Can you hear me?
I can, but maybe we've lost Allison.
I think we've lost Allison.
Oh,
Oh, hi, Julie.
I popped in because I don't know where Allison is. So what I think is the two of you know each other, you know each other's poems, and you can continue the conversation, perhaps just
Yeah.
by talking about the poem that Tishani just read.
I mean, this is a gorgeous poem, Tishani. I was like I closed my eyes and listened to it. I love how lush your language is. I
yeah.
always feel reading your poems that you're not necessarily like the poem is very condensed, but it also contains lots and lots of words. Does it make sense to you?
Yeah.
So I find no other way but to describe it as lush, so rich, in all these words that you're giving us. And it's such a gorgeous poem.
Thank you. Yeah, this one particularly, it was like building on image and image, and it kept going. And I think, all the stories coming out during COVID were so depressing and so disheartening and difficult. But there was in the news this story about 7 men who went back home to their village, and they had to quarantine in a tree because their houses only were one room, so there was no space to be separate. And in the movie, if you've seen the movie, the forest is such a place of enchantment, but of course there's also poverty, and how that comes together, this making of the world such a rich and beautiful and sensuous place, when even if you have nothing, and the scenes of the monsoon rains and the dancing and the water, and it is lush, it is this sense of affirming life, of course, and then until there's death. So then there's also holding that. And I think a lot of the work, and I feel this in your work too, is, and probably this is the task of lyric poetry, it is in a way, on one hand, being agape and amazed by beauty, and on the other hand, just trying to look at the horror without flinching. And then it's like, how do you put that together, and how do you reconcile what it means to be alive, right? And so I think, like, that just seemed like the task of a lot of the poems that, particularly in this book, but in general, it's always this sort of punched on one hand, and oh my God, what a beautiful flower on the other. So you're like, it's so, thank God for poetry, because it allows a way to reconcile and to even allow for transformation, which is key. I think we need to
Yeah.
have that possibility.
I really think this poem emulated the forest. Like this poem is a forest in its own way. Yeah.
Thank you.
Well, my apologies, as you probably noticed, my computer completely died, but here I am back. I could still hear you, so it's very strange. I actually had a note about how both of your books accommodate paradox and celebrate paradox, and so that idea of looking at a horror and then also seeing beauty, and not in a way that neutralizes either, I thought was something that came across in both books. Well, I noticed that we have some questions here, and I thought maybe we could turn our attention to some of them. And thank you to those of you who are watching. And a reminder that those of you who would like to, please do go ahead and put comments or questions in the chat box, and we'll get to those. So first, we have thanks from one of our viewers, Hiba Heba. Thank you for your lovely conversation and poems. I have two questions for both Tishani and Zeina. One, how does a poem come to you usually? Is it spontaneous or premeditated? So you talked about this a little bit before, but how would you say poem, is there one way, or do poems come to you in different ways?
I think it's both at the same time, simultaneously. Since we are talking against dichotomies, since we are talking against is it joy or is it grief? Is it and it's both at the same time. And I think it's both at the same time. And what I mean by this is it's premeditated in the sense that the poem has started in my head without me knowing it, maybe months or years before the poem spontaneously came to me. So I feel that it does spontaneously come. This is my feeling. Oh, it's spontaneous, like what I said about the poem Time, right? Like I was sitting and boom. But what had really happened is that your brain was processing all this for quite some time. So that it's both at the same time. And if you listen, and if you've listened, if you've paid attention and waited, I feel there's a lot of waiting. Like I know you've said we are both prolific poets, and I agree, but simultaneously I feel like I wait a lot. Like I don't try to force anything, and if you wait and listen, the poem will come spontaneously, but only because you've kind of navigated the world with like a poet's brain, trying to keep things, and do in your mind as you move through the world.
Yeah, I love that idea of being spontaneous and waiting at the same time, because I think in a way time is rendered meaningless in a poem and in the act of poetry. And so you enter a poem and it demands a different relationship to time, but also the way the poem arrives. Like I found myself this last week writing a poem about an encounter that I had 7 years ago in Port of Spain in Trinidad, meeting someone's grandmother. I mean, I knew when I was having the experience that there was something about it, because of the whole history of indentured labor from South India that went to Trinidad. And my friend said, you're from Madras, you have to come and meet my grandmother. And I was like, I'm happy to meet anybody's grandmother. So off I went, and we sat, and we just had a chat. But I found myself 7 years later writing about that experience and how it was like meeting an ancestor in some way, and how we came together. And the poem was moving backwards and forwards, and it was all centered around this meeting. And I think this kind of thing sometimes is surprising, and then sometimes you think, okay, this was the time for that poem to come out, because it didn't come out just when I met her. So I am always on the side of sort of accepting the strangeness of these arrivals, in some way. And perhaps maybe I'll add that I think sometimes you push more with a particular poem than with others. There is a sense of some poem coming in a more complete state, and others that sort of need to be left and then come back to so again, it's this rendering time meaningless in a way. And then at the end of it all, you have the poem, which is also kind of eternal thing. So it's really, it sort of makes sense in a way that you kind of can't think of time in a very straightforward way when you're writing poetry.
Sometimes too, I think it's a question of finding language for something that's deeply known but not yet articulated. And so often I find myself writing a new poem that's been turning around like a cloud in my mind for a long time, but it hasn't found the valve of language in some way. And then there's a word or an image or something that gives vent to it. And then all of a sudden it's a new poem, you know? Well, Hiba has asked two other questions. One we've already touched on, but I really want to get to her third question here. And this is for Tishani. And Tishani, this also gets to the question that we wanted to talk about before, which is your experience with dance and your relationship to the body, and how your experience with dance has informed your poems. But here's how Hiba phrases her question. I noticed that you use biological and medical imagery, as she calls it, in your poems. What influences that? Could you talk more about the scientific nature of your poems? Or I guess about references to physical, biological, or etc.
I mean, I think that, you know, with poems, it's sort of like trying to make an alternative house or body, like it's another thing that you are residing in for some time, and it's this entity. And I basically feel in some way that if I was not a poet, I would have loved to have been a scientist of some kind, but I lack aptitude. But you know, I think if you read people who can talk about science in a non-jargon way, in a kind of a way that again is filled with a wonder. The human body is a thing of wonder. If you start to read about it, you just, and things that it's possible. We only know when something is not working. Then we go and research and it's like, oh, why is this happening? But the rest of the time, you know, it's this miracle. And then you look at the universe, and that is a miracle. And so there's this idea in dance of the body being the universe. And I think there's an idea in poetry that when you are writing a poem, you feel like you're in the center of the universe. There's something very almost egotistical and large, but it's also a way for you to connect with the world. And so that is, you know, that is so amazing to me. And so I'm always looking for images that are both grounding, but at the same time can look up to the stars, you know. So I feel like those biological or scientific images, it's sort of like trying to tread out of the usual things that I have in my bag and say, okay, I'm gonna, and I feel like again it comes to a curiosity, it comes to a wonder from being alive and being in this world, whether it's plants or fish or animals or insects. I just feel like more and more I'm drawn to those things and to find out more about them, because otherwise there's this invisibility about them, you know. And again, it's like how do you bring this notion of visibility into poems, and how do you know, just look around. So I feel that's part of that, you know.
I have just one quick observation that I wanted to make and hear your thoughts on, and then I thought we could end with two final poems. I was thinking maybe we could hear Time from you, Zeina, if you would, and Mandala from you, Tishani, if that would be all right. But I noticed an explicit thread about metaphors and their value and their insufficiency in both books. Zeina, in one of your poems, this is page 16, the poem says, "I'm tired of metaphors about peace." Now, it doesn't say I'm tired of metaphors, period, but there is a way in which the poems in O do buck a little bit the suggestion of a one-to-one correspondence that sometimes metaphor can threaten. Tishani, you're a square poem. What is it called now? I don't have the title in front of me. Shoot, I should have marked it down.
Square.
Homage to the square. One of the, I don't have the line written down, but one of the lines says something about like, it's such a refreshing alternative to the circle and the circle's sort of symbolism. And I wondered if you could reflect a little bit, if this is something you think about, on metaphors as a building block of poetry and what they offer and what potentially their limitations are, or just more generally, how you know, maybe some of the metaphors in the book that are interesting to you, or how metaphor impacts you in your writing process. Would you like to start, Zeina, if you don't mind?
Yeah. It's strange because as I'm writing a poem and then putting the collection together, I'm not really bothered with considering how many metaphors do I have, or not in the sense of counting them, but in the sense of like, working either with or against metaphor. Like it's not even on my mind, to be honest. Tishani mentioned this lyrical voice earlier, and this is what I'm interested in. And I think the lyricism comes from, this constant zooming in and out. So I let the things around me, the physical things around me, kind of lead me into a possible metaphor or not. So, for example, I don't know, a poem like Ode to the Afternoon starts with, my friend tells me she's been running in the cemetery in the afternoon. She calls it just a garden, really. First, I am afraid, and then I am afraid everything is cemetery and garden. So that, technically this is a metaphor, right? But I've arrived at it in a roundabout way by speaking to a friend in a conversation. I didn't sit down and think, what is everything? Everything is cemetery and garden. Do you know? So I'm really not so much bothered with it. If it comes, it comes. I don't resist it necessarily. And if it doesn't come, then it doesn't come. That's just, my take on it. I'm not particularly aware of it but I do resist. I think I do resist too much, like too many metaphors, too much embellishment. I really like to let the language lead me into like the labyrinth of the brain. I love doing that. I love juxtaposition, I think, much more than metaphor. And if the juxtaposition leads you to metaphor, then great. Do you know?
Yeah, like expressive proximity more than arranging it. Yeah. Well, Zeina, maybe you would read for us either Ode to the Afternoon or Time, and then maybe we can hear from Tishani about this question about metaphor before we hear Mandela.
I don't know. Which one do you want? Do you want Ode to the Afternoon or Time?
Well, I had both marked as the ones I'd love to hear, but would you have a preference?
Tishani, do you want to choose for me? Just like...
Let's hear the rest of Ode to the Afternoon, please.
Okay.
That's okay.
That's always helpful when someone decides. Ode to the Afternoon. My friend tells me she's been running in the cemetery in the afternoon. She calls it just a garden, really. First, I am afraid, and then I am afraid everything is cemetery and garden. My late uncle's flower shop, my daughter learning to fold a paper into a boat, sea salt, marriage, dawn, old French music. This vertical line digging deeper into my forehead each morning. That bicycle in the city tied to a street post with flowers and a note to the girl who rode it. When I was a little girl, I wanted to bury the afternoon when longing was long and my parents slept and slept. I stood in the corridor and repeated, ay, 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 until I flickered in and out of myself. Some days I even threatened to fling my body from the balcony until my brother, with such calm, looked at me, dangling from the railing, my head thrown backward, and explained, you don't own your soul. It belongs to God. Only He can decide. I stood in the corridor. I stood on the balcony. I stood in the desolate afternoon and repeated, because what is repetition, if not a question? The way mom, every day, with her hairdryer, with her grocery list, with her buying this shawl and that, is asking, what have I done? What have I done? The book says we will see clearly when the drunkenness of death descends. My uncle saw a man and a woman standing by his hospital window and asked his wife who they were. My father, with his prayer beads, with his cigarette, gestured to the driver, taking my uncle to his grave to circle back and pass by his flower shop. My father, with his few words, said one last time, so he, by he, my father meant both his brother and himself. My uncle taught me to sing. Que sera, sera, he said, say it. What will be, will be. I still dread the afternoon and still ask, will I be pretty? Will I be missed? And I still haven't been to his grave, but have driven past his flower shop again and again and again. The way on the night he died, I drove beneath bridges and saw him on each one and waved.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for that, Zeina. Beautiful reading. Tishani, I don't know if you preferred to read first, or maybe talk a little bit, if you had thoughts on the question about metaphor, its limits and its possibilities.
Yeah, I feel like I'm a little bit with Zen on this, and I think like I sometimes find it difficult to talk about simile, metaphor, image, and all of these things, even though, in a creative writing class, you have to talk about these things. I feel partly because when you are writing, these are unconscious choices. I remember something, I was listening to Alice Oswald, a wonderful poet, describing, and she was describing it as a kind of nutrition. And she said the simile is like a kind of going out, it's like the vision is going out and you eating one word and eating another word. And it's more like this is like this is like this is like this. And so the image is being built this way. And then she described the metaphor as going down, when you say this is this, and it's a deeper thing. And I love that. I have like a little Pac-Man in my head that I'm thinking of shape, going more horizontal or more vertical, more wide, more deep. And I think that when we're in the poem, we are using these different movements, using image, sound, to basically try to arrive at meaning. So it's all construction work. It's all like putting this, putting that, and it's really on one level. If you ask me, like, define metaphor, I find these things impossible to do, but it's about recognition. It's about recognition. So it's not, about my poem, but if I'm reading a poem and I read something and then that just stays with me, it's always going to be like that. I see something. The poet has done an act of magic by announcing and pronouncing that one thing is another, and you can just do that with language. So I believe that these things are very powerful. And as for the limitations, obviously, some work better than others. And it's about kind of knowing what you're constructing and how you're constructing it, and trusting the ear, I suppose, ultimately, and then how it lands in the heart. So there's like a kind of little highway here, and how does it land here, and then how does it move into the body, and how is it held, so I do think that a lot of it is very intuitively sound related. So yeah, that's my thoughts on metaphors.
Yes, I just this morning started teaching a new class, and we were reading the poem Two Moths from Amy Nezuko Matatil, which is in her book Oceanic and also published independently in a different version in poetry. And there was one phrase, I don't have it in front of me, but describing the thickness of the air. and there's all these short consonant-based single syllable words crammed together. And a student raised their hand and said, you know, I feel like the sound is part of the image, because we were talking about images. And I was like, yes, yes, exactly, you know, the sound. So I love that idea that the sound becomes its own sort of third dimension of metaphor and relationship. Well, this has been lovely. And Tishani, I'm hoping that you will lead us out with your beautiful poem Mandala before I remind everyone to read both books, get both books and read both books. Sure,
I'd be happy to. So this is the first poem in A God at the Door. And the mandala, for those who don't know, is a kind of representation of the universe, a visual representation. Anyone who believes a leaf is just a leaf is missing the point. In the attic, there is a picture of ginkgo growing steadily yellow, while the body of ginkgo remains evergreen. He works his way through opium dens and bordellos. I'd like to tell you not to worry. Reality has a way of sorting itself out, but panic is infectious. The scare arrives when you're doing jumping jacks or organizing the cutlery. Some moment of low cosmological drama interrupted by the discovery of a lump or the 9 o'clock news. Suddenly, every door handle is a death sentence. How lonely it must have been for the first astronomers, freezing on their terraces, trying to catch the light of faraway moons. Sometimes it's hard to know whether you're slowing down or speeding up. Time's wobbly trampoline confuses us. We stitch our days and nights one to the other, and it's like embroidering a galaxy. But even galaxies recede from one another. Once, a woman played my body as though it were a harp. I slept on a wooden plank and she strummed the strings below until I became a whale shark, pounding through the oceans. I emerged as if out of a wormhole, more or less intact. For days I felt fins where my cheeks should have been. We talk of bodies as though we could not understand the universe within them, even though we've all gaped at the stump of a tree and understood that time moves outward in a circle. And while everything seems endless, there's always a ring of something permeable holding us in. Sometimes we leave the house without our masks, and it's a relief to take a break from who we are. Dwarf star, prayer bell, lone stag feeding in the gorse. Something will hold a mirror to our faces when all we need is to be led upstairs.
I love that poem so much. When I opened the book to read it, and that was the first poem, I thought, how in the world continue? I felt like it had somehow, it was the first time I felt that the past few years, I found there was a vessel for it or something. I don't know. It's just such a beautiful poem. In fact, both books are wonderful. I want to remind everyone, there's links in the chat, but A God at the Door and Penguin, we've got Penguin for O and Copper Canyon, wonderful presses for both books. Yes, thank you, Hiba, for watching, and thank you, Tishani and Zeina, for your beautiful poems. I can't thank you enough from everyone here at A Mighty Blaze and Poets in Conversation. I want to thank everyone who's watching and thank both poets again. Good luck with the books, and also a shout out to, I know this is a belated shout out, but a shout out to Tishani's A God at the Door for being on the short list for the Forward Prize last year too, which is no joke. So congratulations on that as well. And we'll look for great things coming up in the year from you as O makes its way around the world. Thank you both so much for being here today.
Thank you for having us.
A reminder to everyone who's interested, go out and get the books. And we'll be back in September. Poets in Conversations taking the month off in August. That would be me. And so anyone who's interested in learning more about our events can go on Facebook, YouTube, Twitter, and click for reminders and notifications of future events. Thank you again to Zeina, Hashem, Beck, and to Tishani, Doshi for your beautiful poems and for your new collections.